Welcome back to Ducks Dash, the University of Oregon Dash Sports Show. I'm Izzy LaRue. Here with me is Michael Strite. Michael, let's talk about some Oregon basketball. So, we all know what's going on with the men's basketball team right now with all basketball activities being on pause. So, tell me, will not being able to play basketball for about 2 weeks affect them in any way?
Yeah, we just came off of our first basketball podcast. We finally got to sort of make some predictions for the upcoming games, upcoming weeks. And then we had this. And I was also maybe I jinxed it in my head, but I think like the day or the 2 days before Oregon had these COVID issues, I was thinking to myself, like, how great is Oregon doing with COVID in terms of like football had no issues all year. Both the basketball teams are just cruising along. And now we finally had some COVID stuff with the men's basketball team. So when that happens, you just got to shut it down for like 7 to 14 days. It just depends on how the tests come back. But so they're on pause. And it means that we get to talk about products. We get to talk about women's basketball later, but we'll start with this men's team. I don't know what 2 weeks off really is going to do. I do think it has the potential to be an important 2 weeks off because that's what we've talked about in like a season like this is that Oregon's teams really do develop over the course of the year. I think more because of how many new faces always get pulled into the team and how much turnover there is, more than any other sport that we have, Oregon men's basketball grows throughout the year. They start the year at a certain place and they get to the tournament as like a totally different team in terms of just how the players are fitting with each other and the style of basketball they want to play. So that's tough. It's really tough to take that away from them. And it's also difficult to sort of take away these measuring stones of getting to play these top teams. I mean, they were about to play UCLA, the best team in the Pac-12 right now, the undefeated UCLA Bruins, as well as the Arizona schools, who are always really difficult. And that was going to be, your check, your standardized test or whatever for how good is this team, which we're going to talk about with women's basketball, but women's basketball got that. We got a very clear picture of where Oregon women's basketball is in the Pac-12 landscape. And for men, we got no clue. And I'm definitely concerned for what these 2 weeks off will do, and will they just be sort of 2 weeks behind where they usually are in terms of developing?
Yeah, and you mentioned it, a lot of new faces. I honestly think that these 2 weeks could be very detrimental for the rest of the season because you kind of saw they were kind of getting in a groove and a rhythm after losing at Colorado. They regrouped and won in a great fashion in Utah. And you saw like, okay, well, this team, maybe they can do something in the month of January because we talked about it. I was saying I think January is going to be the most telling month of the season. You said February. And we disagree. We agree to disagree on that. And I still think that January is it. And I think I'm right, especially the fact that they're missing 2 weeks of basketball now. I mean, this is very important for team development. You talk about guys who've been out and new faces going into the lineup and guys taking over for people who left the program last year. I mean, Will Richardson, he still has not seen the court yet since the very beginning of the season. And maybe it's great that these 2 weeks are happening so it can give him more time to come back. But then you talk about Chris Duarte, who's a guy who's not a ball handler, and he's been kind of pushed into that role. I think it would have been good for him to play against these Arizona schools who aren't the top tier like UCLA or USC schools so that he could develop it in game, not just practice it during practice or during some in-game scrimmages against his other teammates. I think it would have been great to face these Arizona schools where he might have been the one for at least half of the game instead of leaning on some of the transfers. So honestly, I mean, we're going to see what happens when they come back. We all know the UCLA game, it's still scheduled for Tuesday. That's going to be postponed. There's no way they're still going to go with it just because of how close it was to, I think it was the Arizona game, so which was supposed to go on today, which we all know is postponed. So there's no way the Tuesday game is going to go on. So we'll see what happens, but I just don't see it going really well for the rest of the season.
Yeah, this is a really tricky subject too because how do you measure whether this team actually was hurt by those 2 weeks? Obviously, Dana Altman and all the players, or I assume all the players, want to be playing basketball. They don't want to be going through this. They don't want this 2 weeks off. But it's like you have to create this alternate universe where they do get to play through these weeks and they play however they play, and you find out what kind of team they are at the end of the year, because that's all that matters is you get to like March 1st, and it's like, how good of a basketball team are you? So we're going to still see how good of a basketball team this Oregon squad is on March 1st, but are we going to be able to look back and say, oh, they're not as good as they could have been because of this thing that happened in January? So for that reason, I'm definitely with that concern. I think this could be really difficult and stunting for how good this team is going to be, how quickly they develop, but I'm leaning towards this not being a big deal. And in the last couple minutes, I've actually started to think that you can make an argument that because of how difficult that schedule was, that this was sort of setting up to be a really difficult slog. And in certain ways, you may not want that at this point in the year, especially if you're going to really stumble. Obviously, if you're going to go reach to a high level and perform, that's great. But if Oregon just saved themselves, I don't know, losing to both the Arizona schools back to back or something, then it ends up being a good thing that they didn't have to play if that was going to happen. So there's a lot of different alternate universe stuff going on, and like what could have happened and whatnot. And it all just kind of boils down for me to being like, this it isn't going to be a big deal. And even if it ends up being pretty vital, it's going to be really difficult to see it, to know that it mattered. The only way I can see it happening is if Oregon really stinks in February, right? If they come out and just are terrible in February and it's a really rough end of the season for them, we might be coming back to this show and saying, who knows what January really did in terms of their development, and if that extra 2 weeks would have been huge for what their potential is. But we don't know that. So how do you feel about like just the difficulty of having to measure this?
Yeah, the only thing I have to say about this is all basketball activities, it's been paused for them. They can't go in to Matthew Knight and practice and get some shots. They can't practice together, obviously. And right now, I mean, like, what can you do? Just being in your apartment at home, like with all the Zoom meetings that they're going through with their coach, with each other. I mean, there's nothing really that you can do but just sit and wait. And that's kind of the worst part of it, is that they're not practicing. And the only thing you can really think about it is that they must be watching so much film. They're watching these games that are being played this weekend and next week, and they're just going to be studying it and breaking it down so that when they come back, they'll have that advantage where they're like, okay, well, we got all this study time, all this film time to break down and actually say, like, okay, what schemes are we going to go through? Like, what defensive schemes are we actually going to go through? Are we going to still do the full court press for half of the game? Or are we going to change it up based on the type of offense we're going to face and players? So, I mean, there's pros and cons of it, but I just don't see it being good for them in the long run.
Okay. Well, and that's another way that maybe it's beneficial, is maybe being forced into film study over regular practice. They find that what they're learning in that film of watching themselves play ends up being really vital, and it may be for some of the players, because the thing about watching film is it really is like, practice is practice. You got to go out there and play, but you can't force a player to study film. It's something that varies from player to player, how much they care, how much they're actually watching and trying to be like, here's what I did wrong, here's how I can play this differently, versus just sitting there and watching and being like, okay, whatever, not really being able to transfer that information. So maybe it does give a few players more of an enthusiasm and better habits when it comes to watching film. And like, this could be a situation where, for a variety of reasons, it's a good pause for the men's team in terms of how much better they're going to be, but it's all a big who knows. And I'm ready to talk about a team that it has been in action this last weekend.
Yeah, and that team is the women's basketball team for Oregon. And they had just had a game postponed against Arizona State. That's because Arizona State, they're dealing with some COVID protocols themselves. But we all got that showdown in the desert that ESPN was promoting all week, and you actually get to the game. And Michael, tell me what happened.
Oh, well, Izzy, it is hard to have more of a stinker and more of a absolute trash performance because Oregon women's basketball against number 11 Arizona, they had more turnovers than made shots in the entire game, not just for like a stretch of the game. The entire game, they had, I think, over 20 turnovers. I mean, you got to really, I think it was something like 24 turnovers, which is 8 every quarter. 8, I mean, not 8 every quarter. It's more like
That's
6
got to be
every
some
quarter.
kind of record.
But
Like,
that's a turnover every other possession, basically. I might have to go back and look at the box score, Izzy, for how many of their possessions they had that ended with a turnover, because that's like about 40% of their possessions they just didn't even get a shot off. And then, so you take 40% of their possessions away, and that's not happening. So you only get to actually end up shooting the basketball 60% of the time. And their field goal percentage was about 30%. They missed all these shots. They weren't even having a good shooting night. So you had what was like a really bad performance by Oregon, which, I don't want to say it, but traveling to Arizona has become a real issue for Oregon.
it's like going to Colorado too. There's just something about it.
Yeah. So you had like a apocalypse scenario for Oregon women's basketball. You get a team that does not come out ready to go, really has an off day, a bad shooting night, and I'm sure great defense by Arizona, because you got to give Arizona a credit. They executed, so they played great defense. Everything comes together, and you get an Oregon team that scored 41 points. And this is fresh after scoring exactly 100 points. These numbers are insane. So they scored 100 points against California. They scored more points in every quarter of that game than they did in either of their halves against Arizona. So in the first half, they scored more points against Cal than they did against Arizona the entire game. In the second half, they scored more points against Cal than they did against Arizona the entire game. And they lose 57-41. The weird thing is they lose by 16 points, and they were down 22-7 after the first quarter. So they got destroyed in the first quarter, absolutely destroyed. And then the rest of the game was pretty even. They actually fought Arizona really hard for the rest of the game. And that's what I like to see about this team, is that they do fight. In all of these games that they play where they've lost so far, their 3 losses this season, they have fought really hard. And they haven't come out on top. But they close out the game incredibly well. I mean, they just so Arizona, they get blown out at the beginning, and the rest of the game, they're scrapping. And they really gave themselves the best chance they could, despite the fact that they were, like we said, just really having a brutal day. So that's Arizona. That's the most recent game we've seen this Oregon squad play. And Izzy, it goes in the bigger context of losing to 3 straight ranked teams. UCLA, Stanford, and Arizona are the clear top 3 in the Pac-12. Those are the big dogs. Those are the teams that are in your way if you want to win the tournament title, right? And they lost all 3 of them. What does that say about Oregon and what is basically the halfway point of the season? They're at the halfway mark, and they get to play all 3 of these schools again later in February.
Yeah, you mentioned that right now Oregon, they're the fourth, you can even say 5th best team in the Pac-12 right now for the women's team. And it's really telling when you see a school do so well against the teams that aren't ranked or aren't good necessarily. And then when they see real competition, they don't show up to the plate, or they just fall short. And this is exactly what this women's team is doing. And honestly, I'm not that surprised, Michael. I'm really not. The only reason why is because you look at who they had last year for the past 4 years, Ruthie Hebert and Sabrina Ionescu. I mean, you're relying on those two players for the past 4 years, and now you're giving it to the reins to the new players. I mean, this is a very young team. You have about three seniors in total. Rest is undergrads. You have a couple juniors, but the rest are all undergrad, sophomore, freshman players. I mean, you applaud them for doing so well because they're such highly touted recruits, and you have some great transfers. But at the same time, this team is very young and they're playing at a high level. And this is, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, against this Stanford team, they shot from 3 point line 30%. Against Arizona, 27%. Against UCLA, they shot 36%. You cannot beat these high-ranked teams by shooting an average of 32% from the 3 point line. Or they have some three-point shooters. Yes, Taylor Chavez, she's been dealing with some family issues, but you have Josh Shelley in there. You have Tahina Pow. You have Sydney Parrish. You have Aaron Boley. You have all these names who can make these three-pointers. I mean, Josh Shelley as a freshman, she set a record for three-pointers made for a freshman last season. So, I mean, you just got to look at it. Some of these players, they're going to have to start stepping up sooner or later because, like you said, Oregon, they will face these teams again later in the season in February. And if they want to defend their Pac-12 regular season title, at this point, they have to go undefeated for the rest of the way. They've already lost enough games.
Oh, yeah.
But you look at it, there's really no way that you see them going undefeated.
Oh, yeah. So we can probably say that Oregon is not going to repeat as the Pac-12 regular season champion. And that's fair because they, like we said, they're the fourth best team in the conference right now. So the question is, how far can this team progress between now and the end of the season when they're going to play in this tournament? And they're going to have to beat a Stanford, and probably a Stanford if they end up as the 4 seed, right? They're going to have to beat a Stanford in the semifinal and then go into the final and beat a UCLA or Arizona. So the tournament title right now doesn't feel like it's very likely for the Ducks either because they are, up against so much competition and because they have to beat that Stanford squad most likely to claim that tournament championship. So this is setting up to be a down year for Oregon. And you mentioned it when you talk about most of the games they've played when they're not playing these top schools, they are dominating. They're winning by 30, 40, 50 points. They just beat Cal by 59 points. They're crushing teams. They're coasting through these games. They're putting up big numbers. They're shooting the ball with ease. Everyone on the roster, literally top to bottom, everyone is scoring points. And then you come up against these schools where the talent levels are equal, right? The talent levels are finally sort of just matched out, and you can see what's a team with more experience, which team's got the fundamentals down, and it's difficult. But Izzy, I want to pump the brakes on you saying this team, doesn't have it this year, or that they are struggling to shoot and that they are trying to find a new identity because I think the fact that they've lost all three of these games is not ideal, but it's a bit overblown when you look at how close they came to beating UCLA and Stanford. Against Stanford, they showed that they were good enough to beat Stanford. They were actually, and Stanford is the number one team in the country. I think they are so built top to bottom. It is impressive, and they are the national championship favorite right now, right? They are definitely number one. And Oregon played them tougher than anyone else, and that includes UCLA, and that includes Arizona. They gave Stanford the best game and the best fight out of everyone they faced. So they showed that they can beat anyone in the country. They have it. They just need to get a little bit cleaner, a little bit less turnovers, and just play a little bit with a little bit more experience and a little bit less of that youth. And they can turn over these games. So they almost beat UCLA. That game literally came down to the wire. They put up a really impressive fight against Stanford, and Arizona was their first real dud of the year, right? They had two awful quarters where they scored 5 and 7 points, but they also won 2 quarters. So they, like I said, they were down by 15 after the first quarter, and they ended up losing by 16. So for most of that game, They were right there with Arizona fighting. So it just feels like this team has the fight that is going to give them a chance down the road. And I think this is a team that has shown they can beat anyone in the country. And if they make the improvements over the next month, they're going to be right back into the top 10 because they're not a top 10 program in the country right now, but they are very close to being right back in the mix as one of the top 10 in the country, which is so impressive when you think about how young this team is, that they still are competing on this level.
Yeah, and they'll find themselves as the season continues. It's just, it's going to be early season struggles for a young team like this. And yeah, you applaud them for what they did, but like you said, in the Arizona game, you lose after the first quarter. If it's 22-7, it's not going to bode well for you for the rest of the game. So you applaud them for clawing their way back, trying to make it as competitive as possible for the rest of the game. But Michael, I want to talk about products, and let's talk about NBA products. We will definitely talk about WNBA products when they're in season. But right now, let's focus on the NBA. So, Michael, tell me, who are your favorite products right now that are doing well? Because there's a lot of Oregon players that play for this program that are doing well in the NBA right now. So let's talk about these players.
Yeah. So Dana Altman has really put out, this consistent stream of Oregon players in the NBA, and there's a lot of them currently in the NBA. They're all over the place. The most recent big-time draft picks in the NBA, as we know, Bol and Peyton Pritchard, both drafted in the last 2 years. And that's one of the reasons we're talking about this, is that they're both getting increased minutes. Their role is going up. They're really having some awesome sort of moments out there on the court. I mean, we saw, I believe, Bol is getting his first starts, at the NBA level. So they're really wanting to start him, put him out there, and you're just seeing him kind of get phased into being a regular on this Nuggets team. And Peyton Pritchard has settled in very comfortably with the Boston Celtics. They're giving him a lot of minutes because they love what he brings for that team. So I'll let you, Izzy, talk about Bol and Peyton Pritchard. But those two are the most fun to watch right now because of the way that they're rising. And you can actually throw in Chris Boucher as well, who is an old Oregon Duck. I mean, this is from before I'm a senior and graduated before I even got to Oregon. So this is somebody that has just hung around the NBA and been a G League player of the year, had some playoff moments, but even when the Raptors were on their title run, I believe he was just on the bench, not really playing much at all. And now he's having a big moment at the NBA level with a string of awesome games in a row. And that's something worth talking about too. Izzy, I'm going to let you talk about what's been the most enjoyable thing to watch for you while I track down the full list of these Oregon players in the pros right now so we can give them all their shine.
Yeah, so you mentioned Peyton Pritchard. I mean, obviously, Oregon fans, they had high hopes for him. And I was thinking right before the draft, I was like, well, the Celtics, they would be a very good spot for him to land in. And they drafted him in the second round, or actually in the end of the first round. I thought he was a second-round pick, but he was a first-rounder for sure. And he's fit in perfectly with the Celtics team. I mean, you could not ask for a better mentor than Kemba Walker. And Kemba has mentored him greatly. And you've seen the Celtics, Brad Stevens, just put a lot of confidence into him. And he's playing really well. I mean, he had a game-winning shot. I mean, I think right now he's the only rookie in the NBA who's had a game-winning shot. And sure, you can say that was a tip-in or whatever. It's still a game-winning shot. Game-winning shot is a game-winning shot, so you have to give him credit for that. He's averaging 9 points, 2 rebounds, and 3 assists right now. And right now on the rookie leaderboards, I believe he's in top 5 for assists. So he's up there with LaMelo Ball, with not Carson Edwards, the Orlando
Anthony
Magic rookie. Yeah, Anthony Edwards. And you look at Bobo, he just got his first start the other day against the Warriors. And even though he got dunked on by James Wiseman, we saw what James Wiseman did to Oregon last year in that game. But Bobo, he said it himself. He wants to be Rookie of the Year. And right now, with increased minutes and opportunities that he's been getting, I don't think he'll be able to do it just because of other rookies getting a lot more playing time and James Wiseman being a starter, LaMelo being a starter. but he's definitely one of the Oregon players that we have to talk about. I mean, you look at his size, you talk about how when have you ever seen a 7-footer have handles like that? I mean, he he's a point center. Like you don't really
Yeah.
see that nowadays in the NBA. He can bring up the ball up the court. He can pull up for three and transition offense too. So I mean, he's a very interesting player. The Nuggets, I loved him. They're developing him really well. Look out for him to get a lot more minutes. And then, like you mentioned, Chris Boucher. I mean, yeah, he hung around a long time in the league, and last season, especially in the playoffs, you saw him getting a lot more minutes. He had a lot of impact on that Raptors playoff run last season. And now that the Raptors, I mean, they're not doing so well, and that doesn't mean just because they're not doing well, he's getting a lot more minutes. I mean, he's proved it. I mean, in the last couple games, he had 25 points against the Hornets. I mean, that's a great stat, having 25 points, 2 rebounds, and what was it, about six blocks?
In the
I
month
mean,
of
that's a
here,
great
in the
stat.
month of I was looking at it right now. In the month of January, so just January, Chris Boucher has played 7 games, coming off the bench in all these games, but he's basically a sixth man. He's getting 26 minutes per game. He's averaging 18 and 7, which is putting him in the territory for sixth man of the year. 18 and 7 is awesome for Chris Boucher. And Bobo, you mentioned a little bit. He's been getting like 10 to 15 minutes the last couple of games, so he's just now finally getting on the court for more than 10 minutes a game.
Yeah, and how can you talk about Pro Ducks without talking about Dylan Brooks? I mean, this Grizzlies team, they did really well in the bubble last year. I mean, after they lost Jaren Jackson Jr., you kind of knew it was over for them. The injuries kind of stopped them. And now with John Moran out, Dylan Brooks, he's been one of those key players
Yeah.
for the Grizzlies. And right now, he's averaging 16 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists. I mean, he's been a staple of this Grizzlies team. After they went away from the grit and grind era, they started drafting younger and started developing these players. And Dylan Brooks, he's right up there with Jaren Jackson, John Morant, and importance of the team.
Yeah.
And he's been about getting about basically 30 minutes per game. So, he's a staple. He's done great for them. I mean, you can't talk about him offensively and defensively, too. He's one of their better defensive players. He's going to want to pick up the best offensive player on the opposing team. So, I mean, Oregon, you could say all you want about their products. When they do have products, these guys, they tend to show out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I'm just going to do a quick overview before we wrap this show up. So we talked about Chris Boucher, putting himself up there in the sixth man of the year race right now with some incredible performances. Bol, who really stats-wise, you don't see him a lot right now, but we know the potential there is so scary, and we know that he's still incredibly young. He's 21 right now. He literally just turned 21, right? So he's got so much more room to develop and grow, and if he stays healthy, he could be a incredibly scary 25-year-old, right? Peyton Pritchard, honestly, I don't feel like Peyton Pritchard's going to be an all-star level player or like a great starter in the NBA. I think he's destined to be a sixth man that every team in the NBA wants on their squad as a sixth man, right? Somebody that every team in the league would want on their bench, but he doesn't really, that's kind of his ceiling. That's where he goes. And it's very early in his career, so it's definitely a hot take saying that. But that's just where I think Peyton Pritchard ends up, and the Celtics are very glad they drafted him. We have Louis King. Remember Louis King? He is currently on the Wizards, hasn't played much, played a little bit in last season, haven't seen much of him. We have Tyler Dorsey as well, bouncing around the NBA. We have Jordan Bell, who's gotten an NBA ring with the Warriors. He's currently with the Cavs, but we haven't seen him play. We have Troy Brown Jr., who is on the Wizards as well, 18 minutes per game. We've got Damian Dotson, who actually started 6 games for the Cleveland Cavaliers this year, and this is somebody also that played for Oregon way back in the day. But we have Kenny Wooten, who I think left the university a little too early, and we haven't seen him break out, but he's in the G Leagues right now. I want to see him develop and get some NBA time. He deserves it. But he's another player that was really good in college. And the crazy thing is, among all these players that I listed, only one is a consistent starter at the NBA level, and that's Dylan Brooks. So as much as we want to excitedly talk about Bol and Peyton Pritchard, Dylan Brooks has been grinding, and he's been a really good player and a starter, right? A starter on a good team in the league for the last few years. And that is something that is so impressive. Like, that consistency needs to be appreciated as well. That's a guy that has been balling out, and he's just been balling out like it's normal, for years now.
Yeah, and that will do it for the show today. Thank you for everyone for tuning in. Make sure to catch our other shows. Make sure to check out our website at dashsports.tv. Check our social medias at dashsports on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. Thank you for joining us today, and make sure to check out sportspack12.com too with all their content with our writers.